Recording. Okay,
Awesome.
we're recording now.
Okay, cool. Let's get started. Yeah. Okay, one moment. You do it. Wait, no, you have to. No. Oh, yeah. Oh, okay, yeah, well, that makes sense. And then share. Go back to slides. There we go. Wait, no. Oh, shoot. Whoops.
Okay, I'll start us off, I guess. Hello, everyone. Today we'll have Ian Holmes as speaker, and here's a bit about him. So firstly, Ian cut his teeth or initiated his career programming as an indie game developer in Cambridge, England in the 80s, and studied physics as an undergraduate at Cambridge's Cavendish Laboratory in the early 90s, and then finally learned bioinformatics at the Sanger Center, which is near Cambridge, in the late 90s.
He then left Cambridge for good and worked for a year at Los Alamos National Laboratory, undeniably benefiting from the lax security standards of the pre-9/11 era. He then did a postdoctoral research in Berkeley, went back to the UK and spent a couple of years in Oxford, and ended up back in Berkeley, where he works now in bioengineering department and is the chair for the Berkeley UCSF Bioengineering PhD program.
So during that time, he's talked and published papers about lots of different topics, such as cellular automata, finite-state automata, molecular evolution, transformational grammars, statistical deep learning, genome browsers, the RNA world, nanopore sequencing, and synthetic biology, to name just a few. But mostly, he likes building little worlds inside of computers.
Thank you. That's all true. Would you like me to kick off?
Yeah, go for it.
All right, let me see what I can do here. I think I can share the screen in an appropriate way. Bear with me 1 second. Okay. So I am going to keep an eye on the chat. So if you do have questions, you can just jump right in and ask me them over voice, or if you're more comfortable typing them into the chat, I'll keep an eye on that as well and answer things as we go. So I'm really grateful to have the chance to talk. This is the first time I have talked to Berkeley High in any capacity. So it's a real pleasure, and I appreciate the opportunity, and thank you, Dalila, for inviting me, and all of you for organizing it. I was a physicist at one point, and physics still very much informs the work I do, but as it's kindly mentioned in the introduction, I am now in a bioengineering department, and I also work in the computer science department as well. I'm going to talk about biology, but I would say that it's all very, very physics influenced. And in fact, the modern age of biology, molecular biology, really started when physicists started coming into biology and using the same ideas about quantum mechanics and sort of thinking about molecules and trying to trace everything back to molecular dynamics. We have many concepts in molecular evolution and bioengineering that basically come directly from physics. So I'll try and talk a little bit about those, but also because this is a fun kind of opportunity to talk about stuff that is maybe on the side of like the more fun stuff I do, like not necessarily like the more drab and dreary stuff. I wanted to just talk a little bit about some side projects that I do that are also very influenced by physics and by areas of biology, but that I've talked about outside of the normal academic context a little bit. Like some of this talk came from a talk that I gave at a conference called the Roguelike Convention that happens every year in the GitHub offices in San Francisco. So if, or in other places in San Francisco, I think it's happening virtually this year. If anyone has played roguelike games, they will probably recognize some of this. I'm going to talk about some of those ideas though. So if you haven't played roguelikes, don't worry about it. I will cover the relevant concepts. So I'm basically going to talk about two things. I'm going to talk about, first of all, about artificial life and computer games, and sort of some ideas from both of those. The artificial life being the sort of computational study of synthetic organisms that live in the computer, right? Sort of self-replicating programs, and you can kind of think of it as connecting to things like computer viruses and things like that, but also creatures that live inside your computer, Sims, any other kind of virtual creature that you can imagine. So I thought a little bit about this in the context of working in a bioengineering department and creating things. So I'm going to talk a bit about that, and I'll also talk a bit about some of the technologies that we use to make that. And then the second part of the talk, I'll talk a bit more about some of the quote serious unquote work that I do, where it's thinking about the evolution of life, actual life out in the real world, not just in the computer, and engineering that life and sort of building organisms and so on. Molecular evolution and synthetic biology. But I want to start with computer games because that's where I started. Like I started, as I said, it's so ancient now, but in the 80s, when people were just starting to get home computers, and most people didn't have internet. Like there was no internet really. There was internet in universities and companies.
Oh no.
Oh, let me see. We can mute that. Okay, sorry, Ollie, but yeah. So there was internet around, but most people didn't have it. People in the home didn't have it. But you bought your computer games on hard drives, on floppy drives, or on tapes even, that play them. So I wrote a game back in the 80s, whose sound you can hear here. I don't know if this is playing in your speakers as well. I can share computer sound, and you'll hear a little bit of this tediously annoying tune that's playing on the screen. This was a game I wrote, and I'm just going to kind of mute the sound now because it's kind of getting on my nerves. This game was, built on a BBC microcomputer, which tiny little thing had about as much memory as a long email. And didn't have internet connections or anything like that, but it had sort of 7 colors or whatever. We built that, and as you can see, it's built on a grid. And I very much enjoyed this idea of games that sort of operate on a grid, and the sort of the dynamics that those kind of games can have. And a bit later, I did another game that was sort of set. It was more like a first-person shooter. It's probably one of the earliest first-person shooters, and that's shown up here. Where you're kind of running around a maze, shooting things, jumping, and all the sorts of normal things that you do at first-person shooters. So both of these are available on YouTube in various places. I link them in my bio. I went on from that and then studied physics in college. And for my final year project as an undergraduate physicist, I started simulating polymers, that is to say, molecular chains that kind of glob up together and fold, wriggle around each other. A bit like DNA does, really. And thinking about simulations of those where they're just kind of where they're looking like they're chains on a lattice or a grid. And of course, I was thinking when I was doing this stuff very much about these kinds of earlier games that I'd done, because they kind of reminded me of it aesthetically, and visually. And and I thought, well, I can't really talk about that yet because I'm supposed to be studying physics seriously. But actually, they have informed them, and now I've been doing it for a while. I realized that there are no such constraints, right? You should always be in touch with whatever drove you to get interested in something in the first place, even if it seems like it's kind of frivolous or silly, or that it's like not serious enough. It actually, that's what motivates you, right? That's really what makes things fun. So I've kind of come back to that, and particularly in later years, as I started looking at genetics and DNA and how molecules evolve, and doing various things with molecules, I started to do some reconstructions of ancient life and sort of thinking about how life evolved. And I don't want to shock you too much early on, but I did at some point during the course of this, reconstruct and manufacture an ancient virus. So I do see a question in the chat about whether technology is having an effect on human society. Maybe let me explain exactly why we think that this virus engineering project was a good idea before you worry that perhaps I'm responsible for the pandemic or something like that. But in any case, I'm certainly very happy to address effects of science on society. I'm being a little bit flip about that. But yes, we reconstructed an ancient virus. Definitely one of the things on my bucket list. Can now check off reconstructing ancient virus. Just now have to build like laser beams with sharks on their heads, giant volcano lair, and maybe a space station, and I will be completely done and I'll be able to retire. So I want to talk a bit about, first of all, this artificial life kind of stuff. One of the games that really influenced me as a kid was this game Exile, which was the first game to feature a really full physics engine. It's got this giant cave system. It's all on the same computer that I built stuff on. It's 32K of memory. It's an enormously clever game. It has many, many different kinds of life forms in it that all interact with each other. I mean, it kind of looks juddery and jerky now, but there's a huge amount going on. Full Newtonian physics simulation. It was one of the few games that Edge magazine, the UK Games magazine, gave a 10 out of 10. Super Mario Brothers was one of the others, just to kind of give a sense of this. You can see this here he's kind of flying down a windy shaft and there's wind blowing and he's carrying a heavy object to kind of take him down the shaft. And there's all sorts of stuff going on in this game. Very, very cool game. And I really love the interaction of all the life forms in this and the way that they all kind of the various different interactions between the different insects and animals and creatures in this game, and how they were modeling basically a full ecological system in this game. You can kind of see a bunch of little imps coming out here, and you can feed them with things that you get from other imps, and they react positively to other animals, and they interact with, they herd other animals and that kind of thing. So all sorts of things going on, and that really fascinated me. So this idea of life in these games really interested me, and so did various other games like this one, Core War, which is a game where you literally write computer programs that battle it out in the same computer, and you try and figure out who's got the winning program. And this is a picture of the memory of the computer as these programs copy themselves around, try to wipe each other out. And there are various other things like this where you build simulations of life and you have little genetic algorithms or programs that are fighting it out in this world and trying to survive and trying to make maximal use of resources. A bit like the way that animals in the real world try and kind of reproduce and they have limited resources in which to do so, and so they we see evolution going on as animals get better and better at using the resources and kind of controlling their own. So all of this stuff influenced me, and another thing that really influenced me as I got deeper into learning the math about it was this idea of these things called cellular automata, which are very, very simplified mathematical simulations of a lot of these kinds of things, ecosystems or simple molecular systems and so on, which basically consist of sort of an array of what they call cells, just like tiles, you could think of them, squares on a board. And typically each square on a board can just be in a small number of states. Some of the states that they can be in, maybe just on or off. Like it could be as simple as that, or they could maybe have a few different colors. And with this, just a few simple rules about how each cell or each square interacts with its neighbors, you can build simulations that cover quite a lot of cool concepts. So for example, you can build little ecological systems where there are predator animals and prey animals, and they chase each other around and eat each other, and kind of look at the dynamics there. Or you can build simulations just of life where things kind of spread and die out and die of overcrowding and so on. And in fact, you can build a really rich set of models of physical and chemical and biological phenomena using this. So it's just an illustration of some of these models shown on this plot here. You can, for example, build models of how organisms grow, so-called morphogenesis, or how particulate fluids, in other words, fluids that are basically built up, simulated at the level of being tiny little particles, molecules, or atoms, how they work, how crystals grow, or how bigger things grow, like how forests spread and kind of the way that the trees outcompete each other. All these entirely abstract models of artificial life, like one of the first cellular automata, the one that really sort of started the door, was this one developed by the mathematician John Conway, known as Conway's life. And it just has on or off cells, but and a very simple set of rules, but hugely rich set of patterns that it can generate from kind of lifelike structures and rippling effects and so on. And it's capable, in fact, of simulating any kind of computer or system. And that's the one shown on the bottom of life. John Conway sadly passed away at the start of the pandemic, but he was a very, very foundational mathematician, invented a whole bunch of really cool stuff, and really into this idea of games being a fundamental motivator for interesting math and interesting science. So I recommend looking into his stuff if you'd like to follow up on any of this. And of course, this stuff has influenced games, and I think like that probably the biggest example which everyone knows about is Minecraft. Like, it's clearly basically very similar to the kind of stuff that we're talking about here, or Roblox, really. Anything where you've got like a grid, and stuff happening on a grid, and there's sort of a small or finite number of objects, a limited number of objects that can be on the grid. So you get things like Minecraft, but also, SimCity, which was the original game that came several generations before The Sims, but it was a simulation of how to run a city, and things like Civilization, or really much richer simulations. Like, there's a very kind of niche, almost academic game that's like a cult game called Dwarf Fortress, that simulates basically a bunch of dwarfs living in the fortress and their whole lives and their history and their society and everything. Sorry, I see I missed a question. So I'm gonna I'll just go back to the previous slide and talk about Turing morphogenesis. Morphogenesis is just kind of the generation of patterns in life and in systems. So, for example, how does a zebra get its stripes? How does a cheetah or a leopard get its spots, right? How do these patterns emerge? And they emerge, in some sense, in a spontaneous way, right? I mean, each cell has the same program. And so each cell is kind of trying to do the same thing initially, but they all have to kind of talk to each other and figure out, well, I'm going to be a spot, or I'm going to be a stripe, or I'm going to be a space between spots and stripes. This generation of patterns, not just the pattern on the surface of the skin of the animal, not just the fur or whatever, but also really the whole specification of the whole organism. How does an insect grow from a single egg into sort of different pieces, different stripes? How does a human, grow into a symmetrical organism with arms and legs and a head and guts inside and that kind of thing? These are all examples of morphogenesis, how shapes grow in nature. And Alan Turing, who's pioneer of computing and helped, design the computers that broke the Nazi codes in World War II, for example. Amazing character, really also one of the first openly gay characters in science, people in science, and then was persecuted for being gay by the British government, and eventually very sadly took his own life as a result of the depression that came out of that. But a really influential character and very interesting. Developed a whole load of stuff that is now fundamental to artificial intelligence and computer science. But turned his attention to biology in his later years and came up with this very simple model of morphogenesis that's basically one of these models of just sort of having a board with like simple states and rules. Things flip into different states based on where their neighbors are, and that kind of thing. So a lot of these are all sort of examples of pattern formation in science. That's the bottom. And then there are pattern formations in games. And in particular, there's this class of games called roguelikes. So I wonder, has anyone heard of a roguelike? Does anyone here? Okay, you've got at least one. Maybe if you have heard of a roguelike, I'd love to see if you could use the raise hand button on your Zoom. I know people, or just raise your hand physically if you have. Yeah, okay, we've got at least one. So for that, I mean, now. So maybe I should ask you to put into the chat what your definition of a roguelike is, because people disagree on this, so they have all sorts of endless arguments. I'm going to start off with my definition, and then maybe you could say if you agree with that, or if you think if you think something's different. I'm interested in people having different definitions. So in my mind, a roguelike is characterized by being a game with very simple graphics, typically, in other ways. It has randomly generated levels, usually. So every time you play, it's different, though not always. It has permanent death. So when you play it and you die, there's none of this 3 lives, or you get another chance, or you can go back and try again on the same level. It's permadeath, though not always. And those probably are the main features of a roguelike. So often there's the sort of 2-dimensional top-down view, though not always. So there's a few different sort of things that are common in roguelikes. One of the things, so I don't know if that fits your experience, Tova, or if you think that I've missed anything, it's quite possible I have missed something. I would say some very common examples that roguelikes. I mean, often there's roguelikes which don't have all of those things. So things that have got randomly generated levels, but they're not top down, or they have better graphics or whatever. And so there's a whole bunch of games like that. One of the first was a game called Rogue, which is why they're called roguelikes. Another one was a game like NetHack, and they both used kind of text characters to represent the maps, and the graphics were very simple, as I said. And in order to generate these sort of organic-looking cave systems, they would use cellular automata. So they'd sort of start with a simple random pattern of cells, and then kind of a set of rules that would gradually evolve that random pattern of cells towards something that looks a bit more like a cave system, and sort of a randomly generated map that looks like a cave. So I was fascinated by cellular automata and their use in games. And at some point, once I was I'd been working in science for a while, I thought, well, I'd like to really build some of these things and take it a little bit more seriously and see what I can do. So I did start building various kind of simulations using cellular automata. And the one at the top left is a simulation of a system with 3 animals, red, blue, and green. And they are like a rock, paper, scissors system. The red like to eat the blues like to eat the greens like to eat the reds, and they're just evolving super fast. Oh, and also I put in like a gray block that you can use to build a wall and some other things. And I'm just kind of attempting to build little walled enclosures. You can see actually whenever I build a walled enclosure, then quickly one animal inside the walled enclosure starts to dominate. At the bottom left, I built a much richer system that has a whole bunch of different kinds of things, like various animals that kind of like to line up in lines and or build little loops and circles. And the bottom right, I took this a little bit more to an extreme. And the basic idea of all of these is that they are.
Hello.
Oh, hello. Yeah. Sorry. Is there? I don't know. Someone was asking a question then, but okay. So, I was building a whole bunch of these sort of simulations and getting closer and closer to trying to make them look like biological molecules. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the underlying principles that have how these things work and how they connect to scientific objects. So, one idea is that we have this idea of equilibrium, of a dynamic equilibrium, which is very important in chemistry. So we talk about equilibrium a lot in science, and equilibrium just basically means, a sort of stable state of things. But it means a different stable state of things if you're talking about an area of science like mechanics and physics, where, for example, I could hold an object in the air and it's not moving. And the reason that it's not moving is because the forces on it are balanced. There's gravity pulling it down, and I'm pushing it back up with my hand. And those forces are balanced, resulting in a net zero movement of this item. But in chemistry, we have a different kind of equilibrium. So that equilibrium I just described is a static equilibrium where nothing's happening. In chemistry, we often see the concept of dynamic equilibrium, where things are changing all the time. It's just, they're changing in such a way that on average things remain the same. So for example, in water is, as I'm sure you all know, H2O is its molecular structure. You've got 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. And constantly in water, you've got one of the hydrogens is splitting off so that it becomes just a hydrogen ion, H+, or a proton, as we call it. And the other side is a hydroxy group, OH-. That would be oxygen and a hydrogen still with a covalent bond and a net negative charge. The oxygen has kind of grabbed an electron from the hydrogen. So you have these H pluses and these OH minuses. So you have an H2O splits to H plus and OH minus, but then it forges back together again and becomes water. And this is constantly happening in both directions in water, right? It's constantly splitting off into 2 ions and then reforming to be a full water molecule. And so, there is in no sense an equilibrium where nothing is happening. It's always constantly fizzing off and becoming ions and becoming molecules again. But the whole time there's sort of an equal balance between the splitting and the merging, so that on average you end up with a certain concentration of H+ ions in water, and that of course determines the pH of the water and how acidic it is, right? And so shifts in that balance correspond to measurable changes, but there's always at any instant in time there's sort of a rough balance between going one direction and the other. So that idea of equilibrium is very important, and we call that kind of balance, that dynamic equilibrium where things are going back and forth the same amount, that detailed balance. And there are a whole bunch of mathematical models that describe this kind of thing, describe these sorts of random processes, Poisson arrival processes and Markov chains and things like that. And then we can use those to describe gases. We can also use those to do random simulations of random systems. And this leads us to things like the Metropolis Hastings algorithm, which is kind of an algorithm does random walks and over, find solutions by sort of randomly exploring the landscape. We can then start thinking about ways of modeling physical systems, particularly systems that involve diffusion, things like Brownian motion, where you kind of see random particles moving around, like jiggling all over the place, bumping into each other. And sometimes those particles can react with each other and change state because of bouncing into each other. And that's something called a reaction diffusion system, which goes back to this Turing morphogenesis idea. Is basically exactly what he was talking about. And there's a whole bunch of models of things that come into this category. And then finally, and so particularly things like modeling polymers and DNA is relevant to that. And then finally, we have a whole bunch of evolutionary genetics processes going on, population dynamics, which again can be modeled as these sort of random systems and these automata, these little machines with little states. But now we're kind of thinking of whole populations of those machines interacting. And so, this gives us various models of how genes spread across populations, or population sizes grow and shrink and change and so on. All of these are random processes over time. So I just want to pause a moment to note that, thank you, Tova, for putting a definition of roguelikes. I'm going to read it out from the chat. There's various definitions of roguelike, but you'd say it's a turn-based game. That's true. That's a very important one that I missed off. And again, that's something that is, like all of these criteria, it's not necessary that all roguelikes have all of these criteria, but the typical roguelike has these criteria, right? And so yes, turn-based game, and it's got permadeath, it's 2D, and it has procedural generation, that is to say randomly generated levels. Yeah. So, okay. So here's a roguelike type kind of game. It's not quite turn-like, but it is a game that is built using procedural generation with randomly generated levels. It uses cellular automata, but it's kind of turn-like, except that it's turn-based, except every single term occurs like a turn is like a 50th of a second long, so turns are occurring very fast. But in fact, it is a turn-based game, but it's also a snake game, so you can kind of move around and direct your snake around this maze. The purpose of the game is to eat people. You'll find little people in this maze. You can also do various other things around the maze. So, for example, you can sort of kind of opening a door there, like by pushing a lever. And all of this game, this game features a whole bunch of the sorts of ideas that I was experimenting with in the cellular automata that I'd done before. So for example, there are models of gas in here. There are, in fact, various gases that you can kind of encounter. There are models of polymers. The snake itself is like a polymer. It's a little molecular chain moving along, but there's other polymers as well. Here you see him eating various creatures, farmers, physicists, and so on. And there the snake has just bit its own tail, so that's something that also happens, and kind of truncate itself. So this is an experimental game. I never really released it. Oh, now the spit snake is setting fire to things, and actually the way that the flames and sparks shoot out is very much like a cellular automata model of gases. So the sparks are kind of like a gas. There's also things like projectiles, there's rigid body mechanics. There's a version of this where you can do live multiplayer, and multiple snakes can be on the screen at the same time. I think Delilah may remember playing a version of that. You can ask her about it if you're interested in that. You can also go and play the single player version online, although there are no instructions, so have fun trying to figure it all out. So this is an example of a game that I tried to build using these various different ideas. And really as a way to sort of explore how these ideas might be converted into a game. Didn't really ever finish it, but it is there and it is playable. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about how this game actually operates under the hood, and really it operates using this idea of something, a mathematical model called a grammar, which is really an extension of this idea of the cellular automata that we talked about, where you basically have a simple set of rules for saying, if this item is next to this item, then it should transform in this way. So, for example, in this particular game, if you have a fire square that's next to a flammable square of some kind, then the flammable thing will catch fire and will turn into fire. Or, you know, if you have a farmer that is next to an open square, then the farmer will move into that square. And that's the way the farmers kind of seem to run away, like there's a farmer there running away. The farmers can also, actually, there are invisible sort of scent particles that are coming out from the snake. And so every now and then the farmer will smell that there's a snake coming from a particular direction and it will run away from the snake. So there's sort of things like that, but basically all of these come from simple rules saying when you've got X and Y together, transform them into Z. And this is an example of something that we call a grammar. And it's a very, very broad class of mathematical models. And we see it actually throughout examples of physics models, biology models. We also actually see it a lot in linguistics. That's where it really comes from. The name grammar comes from the idea of linguistics. And so, you know, we see grammars on strings, that is pieces of text, grammars that can be used to procedurally generate text, as Tova put it. So procedural generation is just when you have a systematic way of generating random content, whether it's textual content or a level design for a game, or whatever it is, musical or artistic content. We see a lot of those examples out now. That's a string grammar. So if it's procedurally generating text, if it's generating a sort of a 2D grid, then you might think of that as a cellular automata. And if you're working on an abstract graph-like structure, sort of a network of some kind, then we might call that a graph grammar. These are all different kinds of grammars that are used in this game, Nematode, that's available at this link, nematode.de. And so let me talk a little bit about the last kind, graph grammars, because I think they're kind of fun. I want to mention Jorge Luis Borges at this point, absolutely fascinating author who is sorry, Tova, that's Leo. I see that your name is Leo and that you're on someone else's phone, so I apologize for misnaming you. So Borges, I highly recommend if you are interested in, you know, nerdy game origins and literatures. Borges wrote this book called The Garden of Forking Paths, in which he describes a sort of fictional work which branches, and there are several different paths through it. And we would think of this now as a game book. There are a whole genre of game books. They thrived particularly in the years before computers came in, but they're kind of doing a comeback now. You can still get them. There are also apps that sort of emulate this experience. The classic one that started them all is this thing called the Cave of Time. There are several series. The CYOA is the Cave of Time series, Choose Your Own Adventure. There's fighting fantasy books from the UK. There's the Lone Wolf series. They all have a sort of branching narrative where you can kind of turn to different pages to make different choices in the story. Some of them have combat systems. You know, typically they have some sort of limited subject matter, like often they're based on these kind of fantasy sort of scenarios. And so the Cave of Time is very, very well studied because it was the first one of these. It came out in 1979. And this is a branching map of all of the pages in Cave of Time. And so you can kind of see that this is now, think of this as a sort of a network structure. Particularly, there's multiple ways to reach the same node. So there's kind of different paths that will get you to the same place. This represents, if you like, a map of the book. And this is an example of a graph structure, which is basically a mathematical name for a network with a whole bunch of nodes, sort of in this case, little rectangles, arrows, edges between the nodes that represent the flow of the narrative in this case, that can be used abstractly to represent any kinds of connections in a sort of a network. This type of object, a graph, is really, really common in biology. We have it as abstract models of all kinds of things, metabolic networks, evolutionary trees, all sorts of things. So the idea of a graph grammar is interesting to me because it can be used by defining a simple set of rules for building up a graph like this, we can generate graphs with interesting properties. So one example of this, a roguelike game, at least in some of the senses of roguelike, that is very interesting is this game by Joris Dormans called Unexplored. He uses graph grammars to generate randomly generated levels with meaningful puzzles, right? Often when you generate these levels, they're kind of a bit of a sprawl and there's not much logic to them. But with the graph grammars that Dormans generates in Unexplored, there are these logical puzzles set up where on one side of the level, there's a key that opens a door on the other side. But, in order to get to that key, you've got to unlock another door, which you need another key for. But then to get that key, you need to defeat a monster, but the weapon to defeat the monster is in a different part of the maze. So there's all these sort of puzzle-like structures with a clear solution, a logical solution to it. But the whole thing is randomly generated. And the way that they do this is by using these graph grammars. And the graph grammar is basically just a set of rules for like modifying a graph structure. So for example, we could start with a grid graph and apply various transformation rules. We've got an initial path. We could then mutate that path so that it becomes a sort of a longer path, but perhaps include a shortcut so that if you find that secret shortcut, you can kind of cut some time off the path. Or we could kind of generate a lock key puzzle where the path branches. You have to go one way to find a key and then go back to find the lock. Or you could create a little sort of version of this path that sort of splits and then merges with sort of a cave area in between. So, there's a whole bunch of different sort of patterns like this that you can use to create these structured level designs. And this is an example of a level that was created like that. And the nematode game has this in. So the nematode has these levels where you can kind of find various solutions and keys and unlock things and open doors and explore with your snake going around the maze and sort of build, have those kinds of puzzles in it. This is a sort of a close-up of that level. And these are abstract names for the kinds of puzzles that you see, things like shortcut, and there's a lock over here, and there may be a key somewhere else. I think on this level, there's the key up here. So, you have to go up here and kind of come back and find the lock, or the valve, which is just a word I'm using for a one-way passage. So you can go from this way, the key back to this room, but it's a one-way passage. You can't go from the room back to the key there. So these are all sort of little graph motifs, if you like, that kind of can then be used to build the bigger level on. Another way of using these kinds of graph grammars, this is the URL for the software which I made to do this, is to build these little kind of cave of time type dungeons, where if you look at the graph in detail, there's like sort of branching structure where you have choices. You start in here, at the entrance, you find a chest. You have a choice about whether you open the chest or not. If you open it, it turns out to be a trap, and maybe you lose some health points. Or you could ignore the chest and come to a fork in the road, and then you have another choice. And so there's stuff that happens over here and stuff that happens over here. So you can see, again, these are little motifs, and this is a randomly generated level, but it has a sort of an overall flow and an overall structure that was generated by building these little rules in. And there are other sorts of this, so that at the end, very end, you kind of get to an end of level boss, or maybe there are other endings as well that if you choose this fork, then eventually you will die. And this is a text file that describes this grammar, and these three colored boxes, blue, red, and yellow here, correspond to essentially the underlying graph structures in these different parts of the grammar. So, this particular grammar was built by going onto a Reddit Dungeons and Dragons page and looking at classic tropes of Dungeons and Dragons and kind of copying them to this grammar. So I've been waffling on a little bit about the kinds of games that I've been building. I want to now just switch a little bit and talk about some of the work that we do reconstructing DNA and ancient life, which is related in some ways, in particular this idea of a graph structure for the tree of life, which of course is a concept that goes back to Darwin. Darwin talked about this tangled tree of life, where all life kind of originates from one source. And we can talk about different parts of that tree. And really, humans are just a very, very tiny part. Mammals are a very, very tiny part of that tree. Most of the diversity actually is over in the bacteria. Of course, all of these forms of life share one common thing, which is the information storage mechanism they use inside their cells to store their genomes, and that is DNA. And all of the information in the DNA is stored as a sequence of bases, which are little monomer units that are chained together in a polymer. And those monomeric units come in 4 flavors. There are adenine, cytosine, guanine, and thymine, commonly written as A, C, G, and T. And we can kind of break them down. So C and T examples of pyrimidines. A and G are examples of purines, and we always see purine-pyrimidine pairs in the double helix, so that we have sort of a complementary structure to the two strands of this double helix. But we often think of this, particularly the kind of area of genetics I work in, we just think of this as an abstract sequence of letters. So, you know, we might read this DNA sequence as A, T, T, G, C, for example. And if we look at these sequences, because there are now machines, and they're getting cheaper and cheaper all the time, there are machines that will read these sequences out and tell you your genome, then you can actually kind of get your own genome now. It's quite cheap. I would just say, actually, I'm going to say this as an aside, and this actually does relate to a point that someone asked me on the chat about the effect of science on society. You know, science is a tool. Science is a tool for looking at the world. One could say that science is neutral. I don't think it is, and I'll tell you why. Because I think no tool is neutral. It sort of depends on who is holding it and what they're doing with it. But in a sense, you know, there is an argument that science is a tool. It's like a telescope. You know, a telescope is not inherently itself like a weapon of war or a weapon of peace or a tool of peace. Except that, you know, if we actually look at the history of the telescope, it was from the very beginning, it was both things. You know, Galileo sold the telescope to armies so that they could kind of stand on the battlements and look and see another army coming from a long distance, and using those profits funded his scientific research into looking at the stars. You know, the same is definitely true with DNA. It can be used as a weapon of war. It can be used as a tool of peace. It can be used as a tool of capitalism. And one of the things I would definitely counsel you to be a little bit cautious about is taking all of the offers that currently exist from genetics companies to have your DNA sequenced and for free, because it's never for free. They may give you the DNA for free, but they're also keeping a copy. And you know, so when you do that, you know, you've got your DNA in a database, and now you know, they won't release it very publicly, I would imagine, but you know, it exists somewhere, and at some point Facebook may use it to try and sell stuff to you. So I think if I were going to make one recommendation, it would be wait until the price of DNA sequences comes down a little bit more, so that you can just kind of buy it and sequence it yourself, or like go for a service where it's super cheap to get it sequenced, and they actually guarantee not to keep your DNA your information when they do it. So that's my very, very quick and not very deep answer to the question that someone asked me privately on the chat about how science influenced society. I'm kind of using that as an example to illustrate that I think it's a multifaceted thing. Certainly, having your DNA can be extraordinarily powerful as a diagnostic tool. You know, it has the potential to address many, many different issues, sort of personalized medicine, and you know, the treatment of cancer. Our response to ecological catastrophes and climate change, all of these things can be potentially powerfully addressed by reading, and I will say writing DNA. And there are very, very clear problems that come from the intersection of that idea of making DNA with, in particular, capitalism and things like monopolies and lack of regulatory structure for businesses. This is a very deep topic I could go into at some length, but I'm just going to say that it's a complex one. So there are very different, you know, there are nuances to this answer, but I think that the potential is extremely important, you know, and we've already seen that with many examples of beneficial agriculture, for example, that's used genetic technology in one way or another, including, for example, impossible foods, you know, making plant-based meats, or golden rice, making vitamin A enriched rice. So anyway, let me talk again about this general sort of evolution work that we're doing, and I'll just talk a little bit about this, and I guess then maybe end to take some questions in 10 minutes or so. So this is what the sequence looks like in a very abstract way. You know, often people like me who are interested in the sort of evolution of DNA don't necessarily think of it as being this complicated molecular structure, just think of it as being this sequence of letters. And if you look at that sequence of letters over time, you can just think of it as a sequence of colors, it evolves. You know, it mutates, colors change. Every now and then, you know, there's a new species formed, so now you've got two different copies. There are insertions and deletions, right? So now you've got slightly different lengths of sequences. And there are more and more duplications and speciation events and more organisms being created. So in the end, as this goes along, you have a sort of a tree of DNA sequences, right? A tree of genomes, if you like. And this is our tree of life. And these things at the tips of the tree, at the leaves of the tree, the sequences that are sort of shown in the foreground here, those are the examples of the species that we see in the world today, right? You know, humans and chimps and bonobos and orangutans and gorillas, and all the other primates, and all the other mammals, and all the other vertebrates, and all the other eukaryotes, and fungi, and all of the bacteria and archaea as well, and all the viruses, if you like. Though looking at viruses, it gets a bit far back to see their evolutionary connection to things like bacteria, but there are clear cases where they are linked and related. And certainly within the viruses, you can track the evolution of the viruses. And so, for example, we can very clearly see SARS coronavirus 2, how it has related back to you know, the viruses that occurred naturally in bats. And we can kind of do a whole lot of reconstruction of that and figure out, pinpoint with some accuracy that, you know, there was this zoonotic transmission event where it hopped from bats to humans, possibly by some intermediate species, that all of the clusters of those events, we can pinpoint them in space and work out that they occurred around this wet market in China that, as everyone knows, has been widely reported, is where this transmission event occurred and so on. So we can do quite a lot of detailed evolutionary reconstruction, both of these abstract trees that show how everything was related, and of the sequences, the ancestral sequences on those trees. So we can reconstruct the ancestor of all of the SARS-CoV-2 viruses that have been circulating in the world today, reconstruct that ancestor with some accuracy. We can reconstruct the ancestors of humans and chimps. We can even probably go back and reconstruct, you know, the ancestors of humans and dogs. You know, it's not that hard to do all that. You know, only you have to, once you start going back millions and millions of years, it gets harder, but you know, you can do it with quite recent history quite straightforwardly. And the way that you do this is, again, by building these little abstract machines. And this is where I'm going to start showing a little bit of math. And I just want to do this for those of you who won't accept that this is a real physics talk unless there's a bit of math in it. But you really don't have to look at the math in order to appreciate the talk. So this is an example of a kind of system called a Markov chain. And it's basically a system that can be in one of 4 different states. It represents a nucleotide in a genome that's evolving over time, over millions of years, right? And so it may start off in one state, like the ancestral genome might have an A in a particular position. Then over time, that might mutate to a G, mutate back to an A, or mutate to a C or a T. And so over time, even though it starts in a particular state, because this mutation is random, it's like a random drift, you can no longer say after a particular amount of time whether it's definitely going to be an A or definitely going to be a C or a G or a T. Instead, you've got a probability distribution over what the nucleotide is going to be at that time. And we can write down differential equations for how that probability distribution changes, which if you've done a bit of calculus, you know, differential equations can be used to describe systems in, you know, mechanics and dynamics. So for example, speed and velocity and acceleration and so on. We see a lot of cases of that in physics. They can also be used in probability to describe how probabilities change over time. And that's what we're doing with these Markov chains. We're showing that the rate of change of the probabilities depends on this mutation rate matrix here. So that's the other thing about these equations, is they use matrices. So if you've done some linear algebra, some matrix multiplication and things like that in math and in physics, I would say that the majority of physics, chemistry, biology, and machine learning and artificial intelligence and the tech industry and everything can be basically boiled down to a little bit of matrices and a little bit of differential equations. Like bit of matrices, bit of calculus, and you are sorted. Absolutely fine. If you understand those 2 things, you'll be extremely well set. So I would say, you know, that those are the things that it's really worth studying. And they come together quite beautifully in Markov chains. In fact, we get this thing, and we've seen the exponential function in your study of differential equations and calculus, sort of natural solution to a very simple differential equation. And when we extend that to matrices, we get this rather cool thing called the matrix exponential, which basically is defined in a similar way to the exponential function. You can define it with a Taylor series, for example, if you've run into those, or you can define it with various other infinitesimal limits in the same way that you do you derive limits in calculus, right? But in the case of a matrix exponential, it just happens that the symbolic algebraic objects in those equations are matrices rather than individual scalar variables. So, we can analyze these chains, we can think about the equilibrium of these chains, and we can put these chains on these trees and use them to kind of rewind time and use our probability distributions and probabilistic reasoning to kind of rewind time and figure out what was happening back in time. And I'm not going to go too deep into all of that, but I am going to show you some of the results. And here is the promised reconstruction of an ancestral virus. I want to say, before I show you this ancestral virus, we picked this virus for several reasons to reconstruct. One, we didn't just decide we're going to reconstruct a virus. What virus shall we reconstruct? We're actually approached by collaborators in my department who use this virus for gene therapy. That is, this virus, they use it to infect people who have some kind of genetic disorder, or maybe there's something else going wrong in some cell in their body, like they have some kind of mutation that, for example, there was a recent FDA-approved treatment for blindness that was congenital blindness that's caused by a mutation in retinal cells, that they can then infect those cells with this virus, and it's a modified version of this virus that will transform those cells and sort of fix the defect in the sense of correct the problem. You can also use this, you can infect cancer cells with it and use it to destroy the cancer cells and so on. It's a very benign virus. It's not associated with any disease whatsoever. It's a virus that you can actually only get if you've had adenovirus. So it's kind of difficult to even imagine it spreading very far across the population. There've been extensive trials done to make sure that it's safe. So we had some reason for believing that when we reconstructed this virus, we weren't going to start a pandemic. It is completely unrelated to SARS-CoV-2. It's nothing like SARS-CoV-2. And so I want to reassure you that I'm not actually a sort of crazed evil scientist reconstructing viruses just for fun, though I do see those examples. Not necessarily the crazed evil scientists, but people reconstructing polio virus for fun, for example, which I've always had mixed feelings about as someone who lost a grandparent to polio. But I digress. Here is a picture of the virus we reconstructed, spinning around in space using some glorious molecular visualization software. This is adeno-associated virus. This is the paper where we reconstructed it. It's an icosahedral capsid, which is to say the virus shell is built up out of repeated units. One of them is shown in gold here, into this icosahedron general sort of shape. And we reconstructed this virus by taking examples of the virus that were known from various different organisms, lining up those sequences, the genetic sequences of those organisms, and then identifying different parts of this alignment that correspond to different parts of the structure and different little structural units. And then we identified sites in this particular alignment that were mutating particularly fast, and those were the sites we tried to reconstruct. And we then kind of built a whole random library, as it's called, a random DNA library, which is a collection of many different mutants of this virus with mutations at those sites, representing kind of a whole collection of ancestral virus sequences from this family. Here's a close-up of the part that we reconstructed, and the little bits highlighted in green are the sites that we mutated. And the reason that we did this is because we're trying to design or come up with a version of this virus that would target different types of cells. I mentioned that this is used as a treatment for retinal cells. In order to get it approved as a treatment for retinal cells, you have to make sure it just infects retinas and it doesn't infect any other cells. Like, it doesn't infect the cells around retinas. If it gets into the bloodstream, it's not going to infect other parts of the body. You have to be very, very, very precise and careful in order to get FDA approval for a new treatment like this. And so, we wanted to basically generate different versions of this that might target other cells apart from retinas. I got a couple more minutes, so I would just like to sort of show some more random simulations of how these sorts of things work. This is a simulation sort of showing a whole bunch of different populations on an island, representing, there are sort of different colors representing different types of species here, and they kind of mutate in between the create new species occasionally by corresponding to new colors on this little rainbow spectrum. But The size of each circle represents the number of individuals of each species, and those circles are growing and shrinking because of random drift. This idea of random evolutionary drift, where there's not really even any natural selection, it's just random birth and death processes that take over a population. It's very important to the kind of thing I do. It's important to these models of how these viruses evolve, and it's important to all those models and games that I was talking about as well. Here's one more example of this. You've got a sort of evolutionary drift going on this island here, on this mainland here, and then these are all examples of islands that are being populated by immigration from the mainland. And this is a model of how ecology works. It can be a very accurate model of how you see different species distributions on islands, but it can also go right down to the bacterial level, and you can see, if you sample different parts of the skin on your arm, for example, and look at the different bacteria that you see in those different locations, then the predictions of this model are very, very consistent with those results. Basically, you can think of all the little patches on your arm as being little islands that are populated by a reservoir, sort of a mainland of all the bacterial species in the world. So this idea of the mainland island model is sort of fundamental. Leo's question, can you have multiple mainlands? Yeah, you can, or you can have, a chain of islands where there's big islands that sort of where you get immigration out to smaller islands and smaller islands. So you can build in more structure like that. But it turns out that actually probably, so yeah, you can have sort of hierarchical structure of various different kinds. One mainland and island chains and that kind of thing. The simplest kind of model is just to have one big mainland, which assumes it's sort of equivalent to assuming that the world is connected. And certainly if you think about where most bacteria are, they are in the sea, right? And so most bacteria are out there in the sea, and that the sea is all connected, right? I mean, there's certainly like different oceans, and there are different temperature zones and salinity zones and so on. But to bacteria, the aquatic world is one giant connected blob in a sense. So a single mainland kind of makes sense as a first approximation for this stuff. But yeah, certainly for specific kind of cases, you might imagine having multiple mainlands or hierarchical situations where there are island chains and things like that. And you can also then imagine building various kinds of natural selection, as sort of indicated in this cartoon, where basically the way that bacteria thrive in different environments is because they have various characteristics that are suited for one type of environment or another. So I think I'm going to stop there because we're at 5 o'clock, pretty much at the end of my slides. I had a couple of slides about how the origins of life, which are really just, they're not my slides anyway. I'm borrowing them from a great illustrator called Janet Iwasa. So I would recommend that if you want to follow up on that, I'll type the name of Janet. I'll type her name into the chat, just so that you can see that. I'm just going to double check the spelling right before I do that. Yeah. Janet Iwasa is the name. Let me type that in. So I would love to take any questions or just hang around and chat for a little bit. It was kind of a rambling talk that went over a few different areas, and I didn't get deep into some of the things that people asked about. So I'm happy to follow up about that, talk about science and ethics, or science and society, or negative effects of science, or talk about games some more, or any of the other things that you might like to talk about. And I'd also like to hear about what you have talked about already in your physics club, and what kinds of things you discuss and what you're hoping to get into. So I do see a question, where can we find your slides? I can circulate the slides. I will also make this recording available so you can watch them on here. But the slides I would circulate, because there's a lot of videos in them, and I have a Keynote file. In fact, I think I can just go ahead and share a link right now. So that link in the chat will take you to my Dropbox slides. You can download. So if you have Keynote, you can download them there. If you don't have Keynote, which is an Apple Mac application, then you can look at this video, and that's probably the best way to get them. I can make a static version if anyone would like. I'll put my email address in the chat as well if anyone would like to follow up.
Wait, awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, does anyone have any questions? Okay. Ian, did you have any questions?
I do. I would love to know what you've talked about so far, like in your physics club, and what have been some of your other topics.
Well, recently we've been working on building a rocket, not exactly related to biology, but that's the main project we've been working on recently.
Sorry, what's the project you've been working on? Yeah, sorry.
We're building.
I think she said they're building a rocket in their club, kind of like starting ideas for a rocket. And we're actually like kind of two separate like physics clubs. So they're for Berkeley and I'm with Burlingame High School. And my club, they're doing the rocket, and my club, so far we haven't started any big project, but we've been covering kind of key physics topics. Last week we talked about something, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. Other weeks we just talked about the structure of the atom, misconceptions, all that stuff. But yeah.
Right.
And
nice.
I have a question. I'm really interested in Alan Turing. I've read quite a bit about him, and I'm wondering if he has other kind of contributions to this area of study other than the one thing you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, so Alan Turing, there's a few things. I guess that he's most famous for the Turing machine, right? Which I don't know, run into that, but it's like a abstract representation of a computer. And I actually want to. This kind of makes me think I would like to show an example of the Turing machine in action, because there is quite a spectacular simulation of the Turing machine. So this, in fact, sort of brings together several instances of several of the things that I was talking about. I'm going to actually share a screen here again. So this is an example of the Turing machine running in the Game of Life. Excuse the ad. So the Game of Life is Cellular Automata by John Conway, and this is an example of the Turing machine, which is just this kind of little mechanical unit that's moving along and reading information off a tape. But it's actually being modeled within the Game of Life. But a Turing machine in general is, this sort of abstract machine that moves back and forth on a ticker tape. We could probably find an example of it if we look on, there's many examples of it on YouTube, it turns out. So if you Google it, I'm kind of curious to see some of these examples of people who've actually built the Turing machine. This is kind of what I think of it as a little machine that moves back and forth along a tape, making marks on the tape and reading those marks off and sort of reading and writing. And basically by doing this, it's sort of an abstract model of a computer. And what Turing was able to show is that you can more or less model any computer like this. And that means that, computers are all in some sense equivalent to each other. Right? So, any computer can be kind of simulated by a Turing machine or can simulate a Turing machine, which means that in theory, any computer can simulate any other computer. Of course, in practice, there are limits to that. The Turing machine assumes that the tape is infinitely long, which is like saying the computer has infinite memory. In practice, computers don't have an infinite memory, so they are able to do everything. But it's a very powerful concept, and it's sort of fundamental to a lot of the ways that we think about computing. And so the nice thing about the Game of Life example is that this shows that the Game of Life, Conway's cellular automata system is itself a Turing complete system, as we say. It's capable of simulating a Turing machine, so it's capable of simulating any computer. So that was Turing's foundational contribution. Then arguably one of the most important things he did after that was lead up the cryptographic effort at Bletchley Park in World War II, fighting, breaking Axis codes, so the Nazi codes and the Imperial Japanese codes, and these were like you know, these were codes that were, there was a code breaking system that was developed by Polish mathematicians actually, and I think, you know, in some ways they should get way more credit than Turing, because Turing built a whole bunch of machines to deal with this and did a whole bunch of important math, but it was the Polish mathematicians who used this branch of math called group theory, which is fascinating to give a whole nother talk about that, but it is to do with symmetries in nature and in mathematics, and used this to find symmetries in this incredibly complicated electromechanical coding machine that the Germans had produced, that the Nazi were using for their codes. These Polish mathematicians, which I just think is like, there's some feats of math which I just think, how did you concentrate? Like, how were you able to? These Polish mathematicians did this while the Nazis were invading their country. Like, how someone can come up with a feat of advanced mathematics like that while there's like guns going off outside, you know, bombs and stuff. I mean, it just gives me great, you know, I'm also extremely impressed by people doing this kind of thing in Ukraine now, for example. So anyway, the Polish mathematicians did this, and then very sadly, because they weren't really trusted by the UK government, and so they, you know, they kind of languished during World War II, unaware really of all of the amazing uses that their great discoveries were being put to. Including, you know, when the Allies, led by the US, invaded Nazi-occupied Europe at the beaches in Normandy, there was this massive deception operation they set up where they convinced the Nazis that they were going to invade at Calais instead. And the way that they made sure that this deception operation was working was by using these code-breaking schemes to eavesdrop on the Nazi communications. So that was number 2 of Turing's contributions. Number 3 was after the war, he went and worked on artificial intelligence, you know, at the University of Manchester and other places, and came up with this idea called the Turing test, which is still a very powerful way of sort of thinking about if the computer is artificially intelligent or not. And basically, in today's language, we would say it involves whether or not you can build a chatbot that can fool a human. And that's basically what Turing was saying. If you can build a chatbot that seems human, then you've passed the Turing test. Now we have more refined ways of thinking about artificial intelligence now, but it's a very foundational one that kind of a lot of people built on. Yeah, and then, you know, these contributions in biology, which I alluded to as well, are quite important. So, you know, a whole bunch of, and, you know, I'm probably skipping over a whole lot of little things that Turing did as well, but really, really important, and also just very important as an icon for gay rights, right? You know, in that he was persecuted for being gay, forced into hormone treatments by the British government in order to keep his security clearance. That ultimately led to his depression and possibly his suicide, although it's not clear if that was what really happened. But in any case, there was like a whole bunch of interesting things that Turing did. His life was very important and very worthy of study. So I do totally recommend read a biography or go and look at his Wikipedia page or something like that. Oh, and there's a question in the chat. Okay, do you actually see much individual cancer therapy on the horizon? I know of chemosensitivity tests, but I don't see much headway in this arena in the US. Yeah, I mean, you know, I think, like honestly, I think, you know, genomics is going to change. It's changing everything. It already is changing everything. There's this quote by the science fiction author William Gibson that's very famous, right? The future is here. It's just not evenly distributed yet. Now, you know, that means that it is possible at this point, if you know, if you have you know, if you have a tumor, you can get it sequenced and you can kind of see exactly what's going on in it. That's pretty expensive. To act on that information is even more expensive. When will that, you know, at the moment it's not very efficacious. You can see, for example, Steve Jobs did that, but didn't help. He was one of the richer people on the planet at the time. So even now it's sort of in the realm of science fiction, and it's not available to most people. But I think increasingly it's going to be. there's, and sort of one of the weird things about, working in scientific research is that, you have to sort of detach yourself a little bit from the idea that what you're doing is going to immediately benefit you or anyone you know, right? It's very rare that that is the case in my experience. It's like, you're talking about a longer time horizon. You kind of have to sort of think that you're paying it forward somehow, and at some point, someone will benefit, but probably not you. And that can be very, disempowering if, one has a relative who has cancer, for example, or one has it oneself. But it's ultimately something you kind of got to let go of. The myth of the lone genius building their own like rocket suit, like in the Marvel movies or whatever, is just completely bogus. It does not exist, right? And so like that's I think, but I do think, I think that it is definitely happening. Immunotherapy is a very interesting form of cancer therapy, where you're basically sort of tailoring the individual's immune response to fight the cancer themselves. That's showing great promise. And that has, genomics is kind of at the root of that and is informing new ways of doing that. So so there's plenty of cancer therapy coming, but maybe Berkeley High students will benefit from that. I don't expect to myself, but it's something that will happen at some point. Sorry, I think you're muted, Alessandra. Oh, there. Thanks.
Thank you so much for answering the questions from the chat. That was very helpful. Yeah.
You're welcome. It's a real pleasure.
Does anyone else have any questions? Okay. If not, then, well, thank you once again for coming. This is excellent.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And around.
Yeah.
Feel free to
so
email
much.
me if you have any follow-up or any questions about research or Cal or whatever. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you everyone else for coming as well.
Yeah.